I have used Microsoft Defender as my only line of defense for years. It came free with Windows, it never nagged me for money, and honestly, it did its job quietly in the background without much drama. But in 2026, something shifted, and I finally made the call to walk away from it as my primary protection. This is not a hot take based on one bad headline. This is based on watching an entire year of security disclosures pile up one after another until the pattern became impossible to ignore. Let me walk you through exactly what happened, why it changed my mind, and what I am actually running instead, completely free, on every machine I own. To understand why I made this switch, you need to understand just how rough of a year 2026 has been specifically for Microsoft. Defender. It started back in April when a security researcher going by the handle Chaotic Eclipse, also known online as Nightmare Eclipse, publicly disclosed a vulnerability called Blue Hammer. This was a privilege escalation flaw sitting inside Defender itself, the very tool millions of people trust to keep their computers safe from exactly this kind of attack. The researcher stated openly that they were releasing the details specifically because they felt Microsoft had not handled previous vulnerability disclosures responsibly. Whatever you think about that decision, what followed next genuinely alarmed me as someone who has relied on Defender for years without a second thought. Within days, the same researcher disclosed a second flaw called Redson, another local privilege escalation vulnerability that exploited how Defender handles certain cloud-tagged files. This one was particularly nasty because it combined several legitimate Windows features together in a way nobody had anticipated, allowing Defender itself, a program running with the highest possible system privileges, to be tricked into overwriting protected system files and executing code the attacker controlled. Read that again. The antivirus tool designed to stop malicious code from running was itself being turned into the exact delivery mechanism for that malicious code. Then came a third flaw called undefend, which attacked Defender's own update mechanism, letting a local attacker quietly block or disrupt Defender's malware definition updates, slowly degrading its detection capability over time without the average user ever noticing anything had changed. By mid-April, security researchers confirmed all three of these flaws were already being actively exploited in the wild, not just theoretical proof of concept code sitting in a lab somewhere. Real attackers, in real incidents, were using these flaws after gaining initial access through other means, like compromised VPN credentials, and then using Defender's own weaknesses to escalate their access, move laterally through networks, and steal credentials directly from sensitive system databases. That is the moment this stopped feeling like an abstract security story to me and started feeling like something worth genuinely rethinking my own setup over. And it did not stop there. Over the following weeks, the same researcher kept releasing more flaws. Yoloki, green plasma, minaplasma, each one affecting either Defender directly or closely related. Windows components like BitLocker. By the time Microsoft's June 2026 Patch Tuesday rolled around, the company had shipped what independent security trackers described as the single largest monthly security update release they had ever recorded, covering 208 unique vulnerabilities in Windows and its components alone, and climbing past 570 when you count every third-party component bundled in as well. Two of those specific Defender flaws, tracked officially as CV2026 for 1091 and CV2026 for 5498, were confirmed to already be under active exploitation, serious enough that the United States Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency added both to its known exploited vulnerabilities list, giving federal agencies a hard deadline to patch or disable the software entirely. If you are finding this breakdown genuinely useful, go ahead and hit that subscribe button because I share exactly this kind of honest, no fluff security and tech commentary every single week. Here is the part that really pushed me over the edge, though, and it has nothing to do with the code itself. It has to do with how Microsoft responded to the researcher who found all of this. Instead of focusing purely on fixing the vulnerabilities, Microsoft published a blog post publicly criticizing the researcher for not following what the company called responsible disclosure, essentially accusing them of aiding attackers by releasing technical details before patches were ready. Then things escalated further. Reports confirmed Microsoft began threatening the researcher with potential criminal investigation and referred to involving its own digital crimes unit. This did not sit well with a huge portion of the cybersecurity community. Katie Musoris, a genuinely respected figure in this space who actually helped pioneer coordinated vulnerability disclosure practices while working at Microsoft herself years earlier, publicly criticized the company's approach, saying that even invoking the phrase responsible disclosure was itself a problem, and that threatening prosecution would only push future researchers toward distrust rather than cooperation. I bring this up because it matters for a reason that goes beyond just one dramatic feud. When a security vendor responds to bad news by trying to intimidate the messenger rather than transparently addressing the underlying problem, that tells you something important about how seriously they are actually taking user safety versus their own public image. And in the middle of all this tension, the researcher kept releasing more flaws anyway, seemingly undeterred, at one point publicly warning Microsoft that more disclosures could be coming depending on how things developed. Whatever your personal opinion on the ethics of that researcher's specific approach, watching an antivirus vendor spend more visible energy fighting a security researcher than reassuring its own user base was not a great look, and it genuinely factored into my decision to stop leaning on Defender as my only safety net. There is another layer to this story that made the whole situation feel even more chaotic than a typical vulnerability disclosure cycle. After Microsoft's public pushback against the researcher, reports surfaced that Microsoft had gone as far as getting the researcher's GitHub and GitLab repositories taken down entirely, the ones hosting proof of concept exploit code for these vulnerabilities. Rather then backing off, the researcher simply moved to a self-hosted Git repository outside Microsoft's reach and kept publishing anyway. Around this same period, yet another Defender flaw surfaced, this one nicknamed RoguePlanet, a race condition vulnerability capable of granting full system-level privileges on fully patched Windows 10 and Windows 11 machines. Independent security firm ThreatLocker actually validated the exploit themselves and recorded a demonstration video showing it working in real time. Microsoft assigned it an official designation, CV202650656, and confirmed publicly that a fix was still in progress, essentially admitting that yet another serious hole existed in the very software people were trusting to keep them safe, with no immediate patch available at the time it became public knowledge. What struck me most watching this entire saga unfold in real time was the sheer number of these Defender-specific flaws happening within such a compressed window. Blue Hammer in early April, Redson and Undefend by mid-April, Yoloki and Green Plasma not long after, Roga Plasma, RoguePlanet by June. That is not one isolated bad month. That is a sustained, months-long pattern of the exact same product being targeted again and again with the same core theme running through nearly every single one, a piece of security software with elevated system privileges being turned into the very mechanism attackers use to gain that same elevated access for themselves. When you see that kind of repeated pattern, specifically clustered around one product over a period of months rather than one unlucky isolated incident, it stops looking like bad luck and starts looking like a structural weak point worth taking seriously. I also want to walk through a couple of the other genuinely solid free alternatives I looked at before settling on my current setup, because Bitdefender and Malwarebytes are not the only credible options out there, and depending on your specific situation, one of these might actually suit you better. Avast One Essential consistently scores extremely well across independent testing labs like AV-Test, AV Comparatives, and SE Labs, in some evaluations even edging out Defender on raw malware prevention numbers, and it bundles in a built-in gaming mode along with a limited free VPN allowance. The trade-off worth knowing about is that Avast has a documented history of a 2020 data sale controversy involving a subsidiary that was collecting and selling browsing data, which Avast has since shut down and moved away from, but it is worth knowing about if data privacy specifically factors heavily into your own decision-making process, AVG, which has been under the same parent company as Avast since 2022, shares much of the same underlying detection engine, so similar considerations apply there as well. Avira is another option worth mentioning specifically if you are still running older hardware or an outdated version of Windows, since it has built a long-standing reputation as one of the lighter-weight antivirus engines available, meaning it tends to run smoothly even on machines that might genuinely struggle under Bitdefender or Avast's slightly heavier footprint. Its free tier is fairly limited, though giving you only the core real-time protection module without the dedicated web, email, or ransomware-specific protections that push people toward its paid Avira Prime tier, which does include a genuinely useful unlimited VPN if that happens to matter to you. None of this means Defender is secretly terrible software, and I want to be fair about that. Independent testing labs like AV-Test have consistently scored Defender extremely well on raw detection numbers, often hitting a perfect 6 out of 6 across protection, performance, and usability categories in recent evaluations. For years, Microsoft has genuinely improved Defender from its weak, laughable early days into something that legitimately competes with paid antivirus products on pure malware detection. If your entire threat model is generic malware and everyday viruses, Defender alone has actually been enough protection for a huge percentage of ordinary users for a while now, and plenty of credible reviewers still say exactly that. But detection numbers are not the whole story, and this year exposed a different kind of weakness that detection scores simply do not capture: a string of serious vulnerabilities specifically inside the security tool itself, combined with a company response that prioritized reputation management over transparency, revealed a structural risk that pure malware detection rates never measure. It is one thing for an antivirus to occasionally miss a new piece of malware. It is a completely different category of problem when the antivirus itself becomes the attack vector, when the very software running with the highest level of system trust on your machine can be turned against you by someone who understands its own internal plumbing well enough to weaponize it. That distinction is exactly why I decided my single point of protection needed to change, even though Defender's raw numbers still look solid on paper. So here is what I am actually running now, and every single piece of it costs exactly $0. My core real-time protection layer is Bitdefender's free antivirus. Independent lab results throughout 2026 have consistently placed Bitdefender at or near the very top of real-world protection tests, often outperforming paid competitors like Norton and McAfee on pure detection numbers, while running with one of the lightest system footprints of any third-party option I have tested personally. It handles real-time malware protection, web attack prevention, and anti-phishing directly, and in my own use, I genuinely have not noticed any meaningful slowdown compared to running Defender alone. Setup took less than a minute, no complicated configuration screens, no confusing upsell prompts blocking basic functionality. Alongside that, I run Malwarebytes free as a secondary on-demand scanner, rather than a full-time background service. This is an important distinction because Malwarebytes Free does not do continuous real-time monitoring the way Bitdefender does. Instead, I run it manually maybe once or twice a month, or any time something feels slightly off with a machine, and it specifically excels at catching potentially unwanted programs, adware, and browser hijackers that signature-based antivirus engines sometimes let slip through entirely. Think of it as a completely free second opinion that costs you nothing but a few minutes of your time every once in a while. I also lean heavily on browser-level protections that most people completely overlook. Both Chrome and Edge include built-in phishing and malicious site warnings that catch a surprising number of threats before they even reach the antivirus layer at all, simply by refusing to load a dangerous page in the first place. Keeping those browser protections enabled, alongside automatic operating system updates through Windows Update, closes off an enormous number of the exact same entry points that made this year's Defender vulnerabilities so dangerous to begin with, since several of those flaws specifically required some form of prior local access before they could even be exploited. One important technical note here for anyone thinking about copying this exact setup. When you install a third-party antivirus like Bitdefender on Windows, Defender does not simply keep running alongside it and cause conflicts. Windows automatically detects the new active antivirus and pauses Defender's own real-time protection to prevent the two engines from fighting each other and dragging down your system's performance. So in practice, you are not running two competing security tools simultaneously. You are simply swapping which once it's in the driver's seat, while Defender remains available as a dormant backup that Windows can reactivate automatically if your primary antivirus ever gets uninstalled or somehow stops functioning properly. Before settling on this specific combination, I actually spent about 3 weeks running Bitdefender and Malwarebytes side by side across two of my own machines, one a fairly modern laptop and one an older desktop I keep around specifically for testing purposes, just to see how things held up under real everyday use rather than trusting a single testing lab's numbers blindly. I threw a mix of known malware samples at both setups, deliberately visited flagged phishing pages through a sandboxed browser environment, and paid close attention to boot times, idle memory usage, and how often each tool interrupted me with unnecessary pop-ups or upgrade prompts. Bitdefender consistently caught everything I threw at it without a single missed detection in my testing, and system impact stayed low enough that I genuinely could not tell a meaningful difference in day-to-day responsiveness compared to running Defender alone. Malwarebytes, run manually every couple of weeks, occasionally flagged a handful of leftover browser extensions and minor adware remnants that Bitdefender's real-time engine had not been designed to catch in the first place, exactly the kind of complementary coverage I was hoping a second opinion tool would provide. That kind of hands-on testing matters more to me than simply trusting a lab result or a headline number, because real-world usage patterns rarely match a controlled testing environment perfectly. Your own mileage might vary depending on exactly what kind of files you download, which websites you frequent, and how many people share access to your specific machine. That is precisely why I am walking through my actual reasoning here in this much detail, rather than just telling you to blindly copy my exact setup without understanding the specific trade-offs behind each individual piece of it. It is also worth stepping back and thinking about what this entire saga reveals about the antivirus industry more broadly, beyond just this one specific product having a rough year. Every single security tool, no matter how reputable the company behind it, is still ultimately software, and all software contains bugs. The particular danger with antivirus software specifically is that it necessarily runs with an unusually high level of system trust and privilege, precisely because it needs that level of access to actually scan, quarantine, and remove threats effectively in the first place. That same elevated privilege, the very thing that makes antivirus software useful, is exactly what makes a vulnerability inside it so much more dangerous than an equivalent bug found in some random low-privilege application. This is not a problem unique to Microsoft or to Defender specifically. Every antivirus vendor faces this exact same fundamental tension, and history has shown that essentially every major security vendor, at some point, has shipped a vulnerability inside their own protective software. What differs from case to case is how quickly a vendor patches the problem once discovered, and just as importantly, how transparently and respectfully they treat the researchers who bring these problems to light in the first place. That is really the lesson I keep coming back to here. This was never really about finding one single perfect piece of antivirus software that will never have a bug, because that tool simply does not exist anywhere in this industry, free or paid. It is about building a layered approach using multiple independent tools, staying genuinely informed about what is actually happening with your specific security software throughout the year rather than just installing it once and forgetting about it entirely, and being willing to actually change your setup when the evidence in front of you genuinely warrants it, rather than sticking with a familiar default purely out of habit or convenience. I want to be completely honest about the trade-offs here too, because I am not trying to convince you Defender is some kind of disaster you need to panic about immediately. For plenty of casual users who mostly browse familiar websites, stick to the Microsoft Store or well-known software sources, and do not manage sensitive business data or shared machines with multiple users logging in, Defender alone genuinely remains a perfectly reasonable choice, especially now that Microsoft has patched the specific flaws that caused all this drama in the first place. My decision to switch is really about risk tolerance rather than Defender suddenly becoming useless overnight. I do enough downloading, testing, and poking around potentially sketchy corners of the internet as part of what I do that having a security tool with a recent, very public history of being turned into an attack vector itself felt like an unnecessary risk I no longer wanted to carry, especially when a genuinely excellent free alternative was sitting right there, completely free, requiring nothing more than a single download. If you manage shared computers, run a small business, work in education, or handle any kind of sensitive information on a regular basis, this calculation probably applies to you even more strongly than it applies to a typical casual home user. The specific vulnerabilities disclosed this year were explicitly flagged by security researchers as posing heightened risk precisely in exactly those kinds of shared multi-user environments, since local access requirements become far easier to satisfy the moment more than one person regularly logs into the same machine. At the end of the day, switching away from Defender was not really about chasing the single highest detection percentage on some testing lab spreadsheet somewhere. Plenty of reasonable people will look at these exact same headlines and reasonably conclude that Defender, now freshly patched against all of this year's specific flaws, remains perfectly fine for their own everyday needs, and that is a completely valid position to hold. For me personally, this year's steady drumbeat of Defender-specific vulnerabilities stacked directly alongside a company response that leaned harder into threatening a researcher than reassuring its own users was enough too. Convince me that diversifying my protection, using dedicated tools built by companies whose entire business exists around getting security right, made more sense going forward than continuing to rely on a single, deeply embedded tool that had just spent an entire year becoming the story instead of just quietly doing its job in the background. If this kind of honest, practical breakdown of real security decisions is exactly the content you want more of, make sure to like this video and subscribe, because I will keep sharing exactly what I am actually running and why as these situations keep evolving throughout the rest of the year.